Welcome, everyone, to episode 265 of Silver Lining for Learning. This is an episode on pioneering people who have a pioneering book published by the Pioneer Institute. Of course, no, of course, they have a Pioneer Institute at their disposal. Um, they've been involved with this virtual school movement since the early days. No, 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 no. Not just involved, they created it. I mean, they're the reasons that we're talking about the virtual schools growing by leaps and bounds in the late 1990s and early 2000s because they took a project, a Florida Virtual School project of 77 people, and lo and behold, after a few years, it was what? It was like 2 million students. And so we have Julie Young with us today, an entrepreneur who helped push it and mold it into something very, very unique. As the founding president and CEO of the Florida Virtual School back in 1997, I met her at the Florida EdTech Conference in the exhibit halls in a little booth that wasn't even a booth, it was a table, just a small table. And she was standing there with maybe one or two other colleagues, and that was it. That was the Florida Virtual School at the time. So she worked with the Florida Virtual School for 17 odd years and then went off to Arizona State as VP and served and helped out the CEO and senior research advisor of the Arizona Prep Academy. She was the CEO of the Arizona State University Prep Academy, founding the Arizona State Digital, Prep Digital. Julie Petersen is with us as well, who's helped and the work on the new book, Virtual Schools, Actual Learning, Digital Education in America. And that book we'll talk about in a little bit. And as well, Kay Johnson's been a co-editor and a writer for a long time. She's on this book as well. She's strategic communications leader with over 2 decades of experience working at both the Florida Virtual Schools and the Arizona State University Prep Academy. I'm going to ask that Julie, Julie and Kay fill in a little bit of the gaps in their bio and tell us a little bit more about the virtual school. Then I'll come back with a historical question or two, and then we'll go to my co-host and ask questions. My co-host, Chris Deedy at Harvard, uh, Lydia Chow at University of Toronto, and Yang Zhao at the University of Kansas. Punya Mishra might be flying again today, or he might fly back in and pop in here. No, I think he's not going to be with. He'll be with us for our anniversary show, which is going to be held on March 21st. Next week, we'll take the week off for spring break. Julie Young, you want to start us off here this morning or this afternoon?
Sure, sure. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you for that introduction. Every time we have these introductions, I have a moment where I'm like, how in the world could we be this old? But this really did start 30 years ago. And FLVS started with a simple $200,000 break the mold grant from the state of Florida. It was an experiment. It was a little bit, in my opinion, of a Hail Mary. And the idea was that, could we use emerging technology to give students more options? And back in 1997, as we all remember, we were in the beginning stages of the internet. And so we were, totally on dial-up. There was no such thing as video or Zoom. There was no such thing as
Yeah,
audio back in those days. So, yeah, and it was
thanks. Thank
it
you,
was
Ally.
so surreal in that we were given the opportunity by the leadership in the state of Florida to, in their words, go make it up and come back and tell us how to do this. And so we were able to, as educators, literally sit down at a table. I put a piece of paper in the middle of the table that said student, and I said, we have been given not only the direction, but the incredible opportunity to reinvent education around the student. And so that is really how that's what we used as our North Star for the entire time that we built and developed Florida Virtual School. Okay, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, so my journey with Florida Virtual School started. I had been teaching in a school district in Florida in Sarasota County, teaching high school, and I tell the story of how one of my biggest frustrations as a teacher was the the challenges with differentiating instruction for kids who are just all over the spectrum. I remember getting reading levels for my students each year to only to find out that, and this was not one year, not an uncommon occurrence, that my students would be all over the map in their reading abilities, everywhere from first, second, third grade to post high school. So it was really challenging as a high school teacher, when you've got 120 plus students every day that you're dealing with, the technology at the time was pretty limited. So I went to an English teachers conference one year up in the Panhandle, and there was a lady there telling about this new online high school called Florida Online High School. And it just clicked for me. I knew just intuitively this is how you differentiate. This is going to be a way for me to teach to every student instead of having to teach to the middle. So I was really excited about it early on, and ended up having a friend who had gone over to Florida Virtual the year prior, and I started pestering her and asking her questions, and until I got a chance to interview, and pretty quickly ended up over there at Florida Virtual School. So I was there for about 7, 8 years, and then I went on and worked in other parts of the online learning industry. But yeah, it was pretty exciting to be a part of that as a young educator. You knew this was groundbreaking. We knew it was, and it was so exciting to be part of that.
Not to lose um, not to lose this point in the glow of what an exciting opportunity it was for all of us to be a part of. But in those early years, we had an incredible challenge with legitimacy. And most people that were in the education field did not believe that virtual education or virtual schools were real schools. They did not understand how in the world that a student could actually learn this way and what kind of students would want to be part of this. They, always were asking us, what's wrong with these kids? Are they incarcerated? Are they ill? What's wrong with them? And, and we had so many opportunities to prove them wrong just by taking our time, by working directly with parents and students. Parents knew that this was new. We asked them for their feedback. We told them, we need your help. You need to tell us what's working, what's not working. And every story, every success story became, new ammunition for us to prove that this was a valid way for students to actually learn.
Julie,
Yeah,
how'd it
so
go?
I was sitting in a very different place in the education landscape as Kay and Julie were kicking things off. So I was beginning my career in technology journalism. Interestingly enough, I'd grown up wanting to be a teacher and just never quite got around to it, and went down the education road. I'm sorry, the writing road, working at Red Herring magazine back in the early dot-com days, early and late dot-com days, the boom and right into the bust, and survived through all of that. But as I spent time at that magazine, I actually began to write about education technology, and just started to see it as a way where I might be able to sort of bridge my longtime love of education, the education space, with my sort of newer work on the writing front. But I really came to into the education space as a bit of a technology skeptic. I was not really sure that was I wrote a cover story for Red Herring back then, called "Is Our Children Learning," which was a throwback to the famous George Bush quote, that was obviously massively grammatically incorrect. But anyway, was really not sure what technology was going to have to do at all with education, and spent another decade after that at New Schools Venture Fund, really focusing on everything, mostly everything but ed tech. There's certainly have bridged into that since then, but in those early days, it was much more about sort of school models. How do we train teachers? How do we think about these systemic issues? And really, it's become increasingly clear over the last several decades that online learning has way more potential than anyone gave it credit for in those very early skeptical years, and also that technology can really leverage and push into schools and school models and make so many things possible that have been people have been banging their heads against a wall with in terms of changing the way that we structure and serve kids.
So I was going to ask a question about the history, but Julie's kind of addressed that. So I'll go on to the second question I brought with me here today, and that is, what do you? And then I might throw it over to my co-hosts, and we'll come back for my other question. Um, so what are you most proud of in terms of the Florida Virtual School, and what do you see as issues, challenges, barriers that virtual schools today still need to address, or things that they're not paying attention to that they could address? So first of all, what have they done that you're proud of, they've accomplished, and what haven't they done, or what haven't other virtual schools accomplished that you think might be a good strategic move for them in the future?
Yeah, so I think what they have done, I'll start there, is, we really have had the opportunity to reframe teaching and learning. And I believe that Florida Virtual School had the opportunity back in 90, those late 90s of being somewhat of the lonely only and being given the freedom and the flexibility to design a new way of teaching and learning, and then to show others along the way how that was working and how they too could get into some of these programs for their students. And, whether it came to um, the performance-based funding model, which really drove how we taught kids on an individual basis. And, it's funny now because a lot of people will say now, we talk about personalization, but have we seen that promise fulfilled? No, we really haven't. Is AI going to actually make that now finally possible? And you know, in I, when confronted with that point, I will say that I believe that Florida Virtual School, in a very rudimentary way, 30 years ago, did personalize education for students, and we did see the value and the beauty of what that could do for a student. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we were able to demonstrate that there is a different way of teaching and learning, and we were able to reframe that, and others were able to adapt and copy and take part in that success. As far as, another thing that I'm really proud of is I'm really proud when I look around today at how we were able to lay the groundwork, in my opinion, for much of the innovation that we're seeing today. When we look at what's going on, and I do think one of the silver linings of COVID was that it fast-tracked this innovation that we're seeing today, which is incredible in the education field to think about what has happened in the last 3 to 4 years. We'll say three. Um, all these different models that we now have, the education savings accounts that are in probably 20 states. It seems like it changes every day, but 20, 21 states now, which are really giving students and families the opportunity to actually select how and where that they want to learn with the support of our government and public funds for public schools. And I think that the hybrid approach, which uses virtual learning, the classroom approach, which uses virtual learning in a micro school environment, the full-time virtual school is certainly still very, very active and growing. But the fact that we have all these different models and we have the freedom to develop new ones on a daily basis, depending on what that student community wants and needs at the time, is absolutely incredible. And I think it is an outgrowth of the movement 30 years ago, where we were given the latitude to demonstrate that if you could actually use your education intuition and you could think about what's best for the student and treat students differently, rather than all the same in one classroom, that great things can happen and that students who haven't been successful will be successful. And so I think that's probably what I am, most proud of.
Kay or Julie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think I was going to say precedents too. So, Julie, you covered that one, and opening the doors for today's innovation. I'm definitely proud of that. I see that every day at ASU and ASU Prep. Um, I would say the other thing that I'm proudest of and that just gets my heart fluttering is are the stories, the actual impact stories on students. And hearing, about the access that kids have to opportunities now that weren't available previously. I mean, I was a returning kid who I went back to college later in my 20s, didn't graduate till I was almost 30. And I had kids and I had to commute, to go to school. And what I wouldn't have given to have an online opportunity to make that flexible for me, but that just wasn't available for me at the time. So I'm so excited that kids have opportunities, and when something's not working for them, they can pivot. They're not locked in like we were.
Julie,
Yeah, I'm not sure what's left to address. I mean, I think that Julie Young and Kay have talked about sort of what Florida School was able to accomplish and what they set the ground for. Yeah, I guess I would just sort of throw in on what virtual schools might address today that sort of haven't been done, and maybe there. I guess I come to this work a little bit more as an editor and a researcher than as a practitioner. I haven't been on the ground working on this stuff the way Kay and Julie have. So I guess my call is in some ways a call to practitioners, but even more so to sort of the research and funding community in terms of what we're looking for from online learning and from online courses. And that is, I think we still have some work to do around figuring out ways to sort of measure and assess the extent to which folks, individual students are getting what they need from online schools and certainly from face-to-face schools. It's in some ways even a little bit easier when you've got a kid sitting in front of a laptop or other device to sort of measure what they're learning. But I would push it all the way back to looking at what someone needed when they first chose online learning, whether it's an individual course supplementing their traditional education or an entire online school. Were they bullied? Were they feeling unsafe at school? Were they struggling? Were they ahead? Were they behind? I think all of those things are really important to know before we even look at what therefore is being measured. And I think we have also a lot of work to do on our assessment and accountability metrics as far as understanding the progress that individual students make, not just on standardized tests, not just on grades in a classroom, but sort of really on mastering the work individually as they move throughout their K-12 experience.
so Chris and Young and I have all been with this movement as long as you guys have. And Chris wants to jump in here with a question.
Well, it is interesting to think about time. I've been in distance education for almost half a century. I remember in 1978 flying to Nebraska to work with Nebraska Public Television as a distance outreach. And one of the things that I found troubling across the decades is that a lot of acceptance of distance education has been 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, or maybe even 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and then 2 steps forward again. And 2 recent examples of this, one of them is the craze about MOOCs in 2012, where MOOCs were somehow discovered by elite universities initially and ignored 100 years of findings in distance education to use a very weak pedagogical model, and ultimately did not fulfill many of their promises, even though they fulfilled some things, because they ignored all of that background and all of that research, including the work of places like the virtual school that develop powerful instructional models. And then the pandemic came, and there were a lot of good innovations during the pandemic. I think we learned something about engagement at scale, as well as providing instruction at scale. But again, once the pandemic ended, so many people just said, well, great, now we can get back to real education. And we're going to ignore the fact that the world is hybrid now, and that if students graduate with only face-to-face education, they're disadvantaged compared to students who've had hybrid experiences because they're they're not well prepared for the world that they're graduating into. But both of those are very prevalent phenomena. And I think about, some of you may remember the No Significant Differences website, where there were literally thousands of studies done, literally thousands of studies trying to show that there were significant differences between face-to-face and different kinds of technology-mediated instruction. And the overwhelming finding was, no, there aren't. Now, of course, there are significant differences, but if you average across all students and you look at a particular suite of outcomes, there aren't significant differences on the average. So I'm wondering if you have some sense of what the emotional dynamics are that in the weight against the weight of evidence, against the weight of need, so many people continue to reject any form of education other than face-to-face education as legitimate.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. That is such a great question because of the fact that there is now decades of evidence that virtual education works. And what we always would say to folks who were questioning in terms of the type of student, it was less about the type of student and more about the circumstances that that particular student was in at the time. So, and that their circumstances could change 6 months later. And there was this, this kind of aura that once a student went to a virtual program, they were never going to come back. It was, like Hotel California. And, we would have to share with people that most students do not go to a virtual school for 12 years of learning. They go and they come back. I think that the education system, I would say, I was going to say public education system, but I think traditional education system is so entrenched in itself. If we think about the fact that, you know, all of our parents were experts in school because they were taught the way we were taught. Our kids were taught the way that we were taught. And if we look around today, many of our children today are being taught the way that we were taught, not just their parents. And so I think that there is such an entrenchment that there's one way of doing this and doing it well, and that any deviation from that is some type of an anomaly and some type of well, we have to use this because this isn't available right now kind of circumstance. It is still difficult for me to understand why so many people have a blind eye to virtual education being successful. With that said, I do think that COVID did not do us any favors, and that the fact that we had a country full of successful virtual schools at the time. Most states had a successful virtual school, whether it was a state virtual school or not. It could have been like ASU Prep Digital, which we were not, we were an ASU school, but we were serving the state, that the state could have drawn upon and said, hey, help us as a state community manage through this crisis. Florida did that. Arizona did that. They reached out to us at ASU Prep Digital from Arizona Department of Education and said, help us help them. But most states did not do that. And I think that was just an incredible missed opportunity. And because of that, now we have this thing called remote learning. Some people call it Zoom school, as opposed to authentic virtual learning, where quality and good pedagogy produce results. And I think it'll take us a little bit of time to work ourselves out of that.
Okay, or Julie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, that is such an interesting question. I think it goes to the core of a mistrust of technology in general. Um, I mean, we're seeing that with AI now. Some of those same pushbacks that we heard in the early days of online learning, we're hearing about AI, although AI certainly has perhaps greater implications, and that's a whole different conversation. But in general, I think some of that is unease with technology. I mean, I remember when people were asking questions about whether Microsoft Word and PowerPoint would reduce students' abilities to grapple with the word or with visual context, you know. So I think we've always had that discomfort with technology and trying to find that balance between how to adopt it and use it responsibly for kids and for the learning process, and at the same time keep kids safe. So that's an ongoing battle. You know, that conversation is an ongoing battle.
Yeah, I remember in the early 90s when Texas was encouraging a lot of uh, distance education, and people outside of the state were coming in to meet the need,
Hmm.
that there were two big problems. One of them was that to teach any course in Texas, you had to have taken Texas history as a course because the state was very chauvinistic, and all teachers certified in Texas had to take this course in Texas history. So, of course, the legislature said, well, all these, foreigners coming in online from Nebraska or wherever, they've got to take a course in Texas history. So this was the classic sort of square peg in a round hole. But the other thing was that Texas had a whole set of immunizations the teachers had to have. And of course, they had heard that there were viruses in
Hmm.
computers. So they said all the distance teachers also had to have the full set of immunizations. So, that the mistrust of technology, the misunderstandings about technology, they truly are just baked into human nature somehow, or at least some people's human nature.
Thanks for verifying Nebraska, Chris. Someone asked me yesterday, well, who are the ones, the early players? The first one out of my mouth was Nebraska, now Oklahoma, Penn
Hmm.
State, and Wisconsin, those four. Um, so, anyways, I think Lydia has a question. Lydia.
Thank you. Continue on this line of time. I wonder if you can take us back in 1997. What was the virtual school and online learning like back then? And compared to like online learning or remote learning, distance education, whatever you like to call it today.
The word rugged comes to mind. I'm gonna let Julie start with that one though.
Well, we used to say that the phone was our best technology. And, again, we built our entire program around the student. And so, and the students and the families was super important to us. So, the teachers spent a ton of time on the phone, and we would ask people in interviews the question of, how do you feel about talking on the phone? Because some people hate to talk on the phone. And that was a really key question because they spent a ton of time talking on the phone. Asynchronous content. We did do things like gave away gift cards to kids who found mistakes in the content because, again, we were new and we wanted this to be a shared ordeal where the parents knew that we were working with them and they were working with us. And as they worked their way through the content and they answered their questions and did their lessons, the teacher would get on the phone and talk through it with them. And obviously, they had to learn how to use the tools. They had to learn how to use a mouse. They had to learn how to use Microsoft Word. They had to learn how to create an attachment. All of those things were brand new to everyone. I think the other thing is we did go through this time of academic integrity, which was a challenge. And it was people had a moment where they thought, oh gosh, virtual education, it's just everybody's going to cheat. And we had to, demonstrate through the research that kids were cheating everywhere, and that virtual education was just a different way of cheating, and that it was easier for us to identify how they were cheating in a virtual environment than typically in an academic integrity team. Um, we That academic integrity team worked with parents, worked with students, worked with teachers, and really, it was all before Turnitin.com was available. So we had to come up with strategies as to how to identify cheating. I mean, kids would do silly things like we had a student who actually turned in a paper about his family, and it was a different family and that he borrowed. We also would find students that would turn in an assignment like, a minute apart from somebody else. And you would know that they had been collaborating and had turned in the assignment at the same time. They didn't know that you could look at the details of the document and determine who the author was and, all those kinds of things. So we had to work through all of that. And every time there was an improvement in technology, we were ready for it. I think one of the things I share all the time is our dream and our ambition was so far ahead of the capabilities of the technology at the time that we celebrated and dove in deep as every new opportunity came along in terms of how we could enhance the experience.
Hey,
Yeah.
Kay or Julie, go ahead.
I can add a little bit to that. You know, at the a lot of those questions, like academic integrity, a lot of those challenges that came up along the way often became a design challenge. And I think maybe online learning was one of the first places where we began to see that the old model of the sage on the stage just wasn't going to work because to just have a teacher talking head lecturing over online would just be deadly. So we knew we had to find out, how can we design this in such a way that the kids aren't just sitting and getting, that there's some interactivity going on. And at a time when interactivity was tough, it was hard to design that because of the limitations in the technology at the time. So we did what we could with what we had. Again, even just the phone became an interactivity, right? And designing activities for kids to get out and interact even with their families, their friends, their neighbors, that we had to design assignments that made them get away from the computer because we didn't want them sitting in front of a computer all day long and still don't. So, yeah, a lot of it came down to really thinking about how do we design this if we really want kids to grapple and not just sit. And that was a constant question.
So Young's going to jump in here, and then after Young, I have a question about your book that all three of you will hopefully have insights about. So Young.
Well, thank you. It is good to reflect on time and the past. I remember in 2005, uh, I led a group of people did analysis. So we published an article in Teachers College Record on what I call the practical analysis of distance education. And as Chris was saying, really, a long time ago, the no significant difference has existed. But what we were interested in, that's 20 years ago, was not so much of if there's any difference or no difference. We just treated as two types of education. will say, there's good online education, there's bad online education. There's a good teaching in person, there's bad teaching. So I've always thought the confusion, I mean, not the distinction between online and in person doesn't really make much sense. So because we should be talking about, same thing with the COVID, so I think we should be really focused on what matters in online. So here, I saw that Kurt will talk about your book, but we're at another very interesting time. You mentioned about AI. So I would really like your reactions to say, what would make good teaching and good learning in the age of AI? So not to distinguish, or AI-based education versus non-AI, but really in the age of AI, how does the technology, the medium, transforms our thinking about assessment, about purpose and education? And also, I think when Julie Young was talking about the idea of personalization, because I'm sure today's personalization is quite different from the personalization you had 30 years ago. So I would really like you to think about today or tomorrow, well, the day after tomorrow counts as well, and is what kind of education makes sense in the age of AI? Thank you. I would love to hear from three of you. Okay, this is since you've just done the book.
Go ahead, Kay. You're at the top of my screen.
Okay. Okay. Maybe because I've been in online learning for a long time, I find the age of AI exciting. And of course, there are scary things about it too, right? But I find it exciting from a teaching and learning perspective because of, again, even greater differentiation that it's going to allow, or is even already now allowing us to do the possibilities for truly deeply personalized interventions, tutoring, that kind of thing. I find that all very exciting. There's lots of questions, of course, about how is this going to change teaching and learning. And like I was just reading something a few days ago about, is it going to take away that productive struggle that's part of learning? Is it going to undermine that in some way? And again, I think it comes back to a design question. Maybe we're not teaching knowledge as much. I mean, we are to some extent, but the kids can find the knowledge, right? They can find it anywhere as much as, how to ask good questions and how to analyze that knowledge and how to synthesize it and make meaning out of it. And I'll just give you a personal example. I recently decided to read Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. And it was it was a challenge. I'm a lit major, but but even for me, I'm reading it. I mean, this is not easy reading, right? This is some in-depth reading. But I'm reading along and I'm thinking it's raising all kinds of questions in my mind as I'm reading about, I wonder what are some of the political contexts of this? Or I think this character seems like it feels like this character is being used as an image for something, an image for the spirituality of Russia or an image for the intelligent community of Russia. So I used AI as my reading companion to check my assumptions, to give me context, to help me. And I had to tell AI, don't tell me I'm right. Just tell me, argue with me when I'm wrong, help me to understand the greater context so I can grapple with the meaning of this book. And it was so helpful. I think teaching kids to do that kind of thing can make it a powerful ally for them. And teaching teachers and instructional designers to design in such a way that makes AI that true companion rather than giving them the answers. It's going to be a different way of teaching and learning.
Julie?
I have to confess, of the three authors, and we experienced this a few times as we worked on this book, I am maybe the youngest, but also the most the most analog of the group. I barely use AI. I am in a family where I've got two teenagers and a husband who are all enthusiastically diving in. And I'm the I don't know the skeptic, the slowpoke. I've been a little slow to the work, and so I guess the place that I sit as I try to think about where AI might be taking us as far as sort of where education has been moving. And I think it's in parallel in some ways with some of these other dynamics around the role of technology, the role of online learning is the push and pull that is always fascinating to me is the push and pull of our education systems between what's good for individuals and what's good for the system, what's good for groups and communities. And I feel like there's that tension is one of the things that makes technology both exciting and uncomfortable, right? Exciting in the sense of it can remove some barriers, it can break down, it doesn't matter where you're sitting, you can hop on your computer and get that same content that someone, whether you're in the middle of Kansas or the middle of New York City, you have access to some of that same stuff. But I think the place that we're all challenged to kind of really think about is how can we use online education, technology, AI, all of these sort of streams to both kind of supercharge things for individuals, but also make sure that we're taking into account sort of how we work together as humans, as communities, and not to lose out on that kind of human interaction and what is best for the whole group of kids, right? And the ways in which that they work together and the ways they work together with the older teaching generation as well. So I don't really have any great answers there, but I feel like that's the dynamic that on the tension point that I always find really interesting to kind of reflect on here. But Kay and Julie, yeah, are definitely much more on the ground in the mix of really looking at how this is actually manifesting in classrooms and in schools.
Well, one of the interesting opportunities about AI is that it needs huge amounts of data in order to function well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's simply not possible to collect that amount of data in face-to-face learning, but it's very much possible in online learning.
Mm-hmm.
And so it may be that online learning will develop some advantages, demonstrable advantages over face-to-face, because the AI models of students will be much richer just because of the data that can be collected.
Julie Young, you have a comment before we talk about the book?
I think my only, kind of capstone comment is I think my internet's unstable. Are you hearing me okay?
We gotcha. It's delayed once in a while. We gotcha.
Okay. All right. Is that I think AI can be a tremendous tool to enable the teacher to teach. And I think that, for example, using AI to redirect the learning, using AI for personalizing lessons for students, whether that is creating some lessons with great guidance from the teacher and the data, or using it as an underlying tool to other resources that you may be using with students so that you can direct their learning in a more expedient and efficient way. I think that teachers spend a lot of time, analyzing data that could be analyzed by AI, and then that data could be fed to the teacher as opposed to the teacher having to go find it. I just think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to change the profession, some of uh, the angst of the profession, and some of the things that teachers are spending their time on that actually drain them. And then I also do think that we have to teach kids how to use this tool because it's at home. So whether they're using it in their classroom, whether they're using it in their virtual classroom, their parents are using it, their siblings are using it, their teachers are using it. It is part of our world now. And so teaching them to use it, not as an enabler, but as a tool that actually could potentially expand their curiosity and expand their capabilities in as a learner is something that we have a responsibility to do.
Thank you all. But we've just gotten started because there's a new book here that's come out. So, Virtual Schools, Actual Learning, Digital Education in America. So, tell us what led to the book. Tell us who's in the book. Are there, different states represented or institutions or countries even? And how do you hope the book will be used in the future?
Maybe I'll start with this one, and then we can definitely Kay and Julie will catch me on what I miss, and certainly double clicking into some of those states and stories would be really important here. But as you mentioned at the top of the episode, Kurt, the pioneer folks wanted to think about this sort of pioneering. And realized that they had some papers that had been written in the kind of early 2010s and some papers written during the pandemic, and so thought, if we pulled this stuff together into kind of a history of virtual schooling, how can that help us not just kind of look back over the last 30 years, but do exactly what we've been doing in this episode today around sort of using that to kind of help guide practitioners and policymakers as we think about what this means moving forward as we move into this age of AI, this age of increased kind of school choice and parent voice, and so forth. And so, in terms of other sort of voices in the book, I think it's important to mention Michael Horn, who everyone I'm sure on this podcast is very familiar with. Who weren't
He's
able
been
to
on
have
this
join us
podcast,
today.
so
Yeah, was wrote our forward for us and also helped give us feedback kind of all along the way. He's obviously been a really prolific author in K-12 and the career space and online and personalized learning, but his forward really talks about this notion that online learning has the potential to meet individual student needs and actually anchors some of it and kind of some of his own experiences and the good and the bad, which I'm sure we all have those stories from our own children or our own selves in terms of sort of great experiences and terrible experiences online, and really kind of reminds us that it's not about online or offline that makes something positive or negative. It's really about the pedagogy and the design. So that's sort of what brought us together to kind of take those anchor couple of early papers, and we added in a little in the beginning and a little in the middle and a little reflection at the end to kind of help bridge it all together and think about sort of what we can take away from these last 30 years of online and digital learning. Yeah, I mean, Kay and Julie, what did I miss, and what else is important for people to know about the book?
I think we could
Great.
just say that it was it's kind of taking you on a tour of watching innovation happen and watching all of the policy roadblocks, the funding roadblocks, and that's the negative. The positive is the policy innovation and the funding innovation that came as people like Julie and other leaders from virtual schools across the nation began to gather together. That was an important part of the journey. The fact that there was a coming together of those who were leading in this space, and they began to advocate together for the policies and the funding structures that would support innovation. And so the book outlines that history as well, and provides some key milestones of what started to happen. Like, for instance, I forget what year it was, that Michigan decided to make taking an online class a requirement for graduation. And so that really kind of catapulted some growth in online learning and some legitimacy. Sadly, to kind of go back to the point we were talking before about knee-jerk reactions after COVID, I think they took that requirement away. And Florida had that requirement for a while as well. But you see, it's that, like you said, two steps forward, three steps back. But that is the nature of it. And I think for anyone who's interested in looking at policies that are working do help, the policies that are focusing on student outcomes versus inputs like seat time, those are the policies that tend to support innovation the most. Anything
I
else,
think
Julie?
just to add that we have the toolkit that goes with the book, and the toolkit is actually a wonderful resource for teachers and leaders that has case studies of different leaders and different states and what they went through during this time. I think for me, it chronicles the struggle and it captures 30 years of getting us where we are today. It didn't happen overnight. And so for anybody who knows, it's a great resource to kind of go, okay, how was all this happening and how did we navigate it? And so I think that, that together, I do have a new book coming out in April. The name of my new book is Say Yes, How Virtual Became Reality. And it's also being published by the Pioneer Institute. And it chronicles my journey from a personal perspective of having the opportunity to be part of building a new industry and everything we've talked about, the opportunity to build something like this from scratch and how it all worked with our state and our government and all the people that, jumped in on being part of something that was completely nascent and no one had any idea what it would look like. So that'll be fun too. And the two books will be offered together at some point as well.
Quick questions for you on this. Is this book an edited book of people with different chapters, which is what the website says, or is this all the chapters authored by you?
The book that's already out, our book?
No, it is a
Julie's book.
yeah, book that's out. Go ahead, Julie.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say yeah. So the book that the three
Go
of
ahead,
us
Julie.
co-edited together is a mix of edited chapters, most of which were written by Julie Young and or Bill Donovan, a writer who worked with the Pioneer Institute in the early 2010s and during the pandemic to write some of the initial papers, and then we supplemented that with various chapters written by the three of us to kind of fill in the gaps in the early, middle, and sort of current day. Information. And then Julie's book, I think, is purely Julie. Yeah.
Yeah. The reason I ask is, are there major players, people that we need to mention in some part of the U.S., leaders in the field? I'll go back then. My second part of that question, in 1997, in 1996, when you were looking through the literature and creating this school, the Florida Virtual School, were there people already engaged in this? And who would they be? I'm asking this for the standpoint of graduate students who are listening to this episode who want the history of all this and might want to read original pieces and might want to read about the original technologies that were being used. Can you point us to someone or something of value there that an instructor teaching a course in, online learning or technologies in education, or a student today enrolling might want to read, or people that they might want to read about who are innovative, who led to the first, as you said, Julie, it didn't just happen. It happened over a series of years. As Chris pointed out, he's been in this 50 years. It's probably longer than that. So is there anything or anyone you want to mention?
Yeah. No. In my new book, I have a whole section on kind of what happened before Florida Virtual School and some of, not as far back as Chris goes, but certainly with the virtual education space versus the distance learning or the paper distance learning that we did so long ago. But I think it's important to note, in Massachusetts, they had the Concord Consortium that was starting kind of at the same time as Florida Virtual School, but had a very, very different model and a very, very different objective. You had the Tom Vander Ark model that was back in 1995 out in Seattle, where he was a superintendent, I believe, at the time, and he did not have a statewide initiative, but he certainly did have an initiative in his district. You had the proponents of Connections Academy and certainly K12.com that came a bit after Florida Virtual School that again were completely different for-profit models. You had the Nebraska model that we talked about earlier. We also had the model in Utah that actually started, it was called the Electronic School, and it actually started, I think, also in the 94, 95 range. And so some of those are called out in this book, and they're definitely called out in my new book.
Ohio had the electronic classrooms of tomorrow, ECOT, which failed. Mostly, a lot of these things failed, and then
ECOT, that's right.
especially in Ohio and Michigan, where Young was in Michigan, a lot of things failed. A lot of things. Michigan was a leader, a thought leader. Indiana would pass a law, and then they'd see things that Ohio would mess up on. They rescind the laws, right? About 6 months later, and all this, and back and forth, back and forth. Chris has a reference to one of his articles. Chris, did you want to mention that?
Yeah, a major journal for many years was the American Journal of Distance Education. And that's a good resource to look at for overviews of where the field was at different points. In 1996, I did a keynote at a conference at Penn State, sponsored by the head of the American Journal of Distance Education. And the keynote was so controversial that they had a special issue of the journal that came out where I published my talk, and then 10 people responded, five in favor and five against. It was really fun as a format, and I wish that we would see that kind of format more often. But I think one resource to look at over at least the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century would be the American Journal of Distance Education.
Yeah, I agree.
And Chris is referring to Michael Moore at Penn State, who's kind of the thought leader behind learner, content learner, learner interaction. I added learner self-interaction to that, and others have added other pieces. And Michael Moore was mentored by Charles Wedemeyer at the University of Wisconsin, who has a book, Learning at the Back Door, Reflections on Non-Traditional Learning Across the Lifespan, which has been reissued by the University of Wisconsin recently. And I highly recommend the book, and you can often get it for $1 on Amazon. Every sentence in that book is quotable. Charles Wedemeyer predicted blended learning, predicted the use of video conferencing in education in the 1950s, blended learning predicted in the 1960s. Julie's run across that name. Chris has keynoted the Wisconsin conference many times. I know I saw him there. And so I just wanted to mention him. We're running low on time here. I think we got 1 minute left. Does anyone have a final comment or anything they'd like to say and get on the record here today?
I would just say thank you for having us. It is an opportunity for the education space to see, kind of how the sausage was made over the last 30 years in the K-12 space specifically. And I think especially for young educators, it's good for them to know. It's good history for them to have. And I appreciate you raising the awareness not only of the book and of the authors, but of the industry and the journey itself.
Yeah, I think my only final comment would actually be if I can put Kay on the spot just for a second, because I think um, the point we keep coming back to here is the importance of keeping online learning available as an option for kids who just don't fit into the traditional box, and continuing to think about ways to meet individual student learning. And I feel like Kay has come across some really fascinating student stories in these last couple of months as we've been out sort of talking about the book. And I wonder, Kay, if you can just share a couple of those stories just to kind of keep these individual kids' needs at the forefront of our minds as we think about these opportunities to kind of create learning models that work for all kids and not just some kids.
Well, I don't
Keep
have
it to like 30 seconds, then we have to close
30
it.
seconds. I'll give you one story that I heard recently about a young girl that we have learning success coaches at ASU Prep, and the success coach kept, trying to connect with this young student, and every time she called her, she realized that this student was driving somewhere. And after time and prodding, it came out that the student was actually the caregiver for her younger siblings because her mother was legally blind. And she was getting way behind. Long story short, through that persistent communication, the learning success coach was able to work out a plan with her to help her graduate. That was her goal, to graduate with her class and to help her graduate. So this is just one of thousands of examples of the unique needs that students have and how online learning helped meet that need for that student. That's what makes our teacher hearts go pitter patter, and that's why we keep doing this.
Thank you all. And I see I see all my co-hosts nodding their heads too. And we all would like to make a final comment, but we've run out of time here today. But I will say when Julie Young says young students have been impacted, 2 million Julie Young students have been impacted. There's a pun there in the young students being impacted. But thank you all. And it's been lovely. And I'm going to work on the book, The World is Wide Open, follow up to my World is Open books. I'll be talking to you, Kay, about possible students to interview for that.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Just thank you. Yes. Yes.
Thank you,
So
guys.
the next episode
Absolutely.
is in 2 weeks, and it is a Host Reflect show at noon at this point. It's our 6-year anniversary show on March 21st of
Yay.
2020. Thank you, everyone.